Hey guys, welcome back to Boring Historian. Tonight we are delving into a tale so peculiar, so utterly unserious for an emperor, that you might just find yourself chuckling softly, even though, if you were living in ancient Rome under our subjects' reign, that chuckle could land you in quite a pickle. Imagine, if you will, the flickering oil lamps casting long, dancing shadows across cold marble floors. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment, and the faint, unsettling aroma of fear mixed with, well, probably a bit of old Roman sewage, let's be honest. You're a citizen, perhaps a humble baker, perhaps a senator with too much toga and not enough patience. You're walking through the forum, and suddenly, a quiet joke escapes your lips. A tiny, involuntary puff of air. But in this Rome, under this particular emperor, even that small release of mirth could be a dangerous, even life-threatening transgression. You'd probably not survive a week without accidentally offending someone by just having a good time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the vast, sprawling, magnificent, and often utterly bizarre world of the Roman Empire, specifically during a period known as the Severan dynasty. This was a time of immense change, of shifting power dynamics, and of emperors who, frankly, had a flair for the dramatic. And among them, shining or perhaps smoldering brightest in his unique brand of imperial strangeness, was a young man named Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus in 203 AD. He would eventually ascend to the very pinnacle of Roman power, but not before a series of events so improbable they sound like something from a particularly over-the-top historical novel. Elagabalus was destined for a life steeped in religious devotion long before he was ever destined for the purple robes of an emperor. His family, you see, hailed from Emesa in Syria, and they were the hereditary high priests of a powerful sun god known as Elagabal, or Heliogabalus, as the Greeks called him. This was no minor deity. Elagabal was revered with a fierce, almost fanatical devotion, symbolized by a large black conical stone, said to have fallen from the heavens. Imagine, if you will, being raised from infancy with the weight of divine responsibility on your tiny shoulders, told that you are not just a boy, but the living, breathing conduit for a powerful cosmic force. It's enough to warp anyone's perspective a little, wouldn't you say? Especially when you consider that the Roman pantheon, while vast, was a more, shall we say, flexible arrangement of deities. This intense singular devotion to a foreign sun god would become the very bedrock of Elagabalus's reign, influencing every decision, every eccentricity, and ultimately every one of his peculiar attempts to reshape Roman society in his own image, right down to how its citizens were allowed to express joy. Historians still argue whether his religious fervor was genuine spiritual conviction or a shrewd political tool, but what's undeniable is its profound impact. This young man, brought up in an atmosphere of mystic ritual and unshakable belief, was about to be thrust into the rigid, often brutal, world of Roman politics. And the clash, my dear listener, was going to be something to behold. You see, the Roman Empire, for all its might and architectural marvels, was also a place of bewildering excesses, especially at the top. Imagine a world without Instagram or reality TV, where the only way to truly show off your wealth and power was through jaw-dropping displays of opulence, and occasionally sheer madness. The imperial court, particularly in the centuries after Augustus, became a stage for individuals who were, shall we say, unfiltered. We're talking emperors who built golden palaces, emperors who made their horses consuls, and emperors who, well, tried to ban laughter. This was the backdrop against which young Elagabalus fresh from his Syrian temple duties, was about to make his grand entrance. The standard Roman emperor was expected to be a military leader, a skilled administrator, and a patron of the arts, someone who could project an image of stoic strength and traditional Roman virtue. But by the early 3rd century AD, that image was cracking faster than a cheap clay pot. The Severan dynasty itself was founded by Septimius Severus, a shrewd and capable military man who essentially muscled his way to power. His reign and that of his son Caracalla had been marked by intense militarism and a certain disregard for the niceties of senatorial politics. Caracalla, infamous for his brutal purges and the extension of Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, primarily for tax purposes, naturally left behind a legacy of instability. And into this void stepped Elagabalus, not as a seasoned general, but as a priest, a boy king groomed by his formidable grandmother, Julia Maesa. She was the true political mastermind, pulling strings from behind the scenes, using the family's deep connection to the Elagal cult as a means to gain popular support, and crucially, the loyalty of the army. It was a remarkable feat of political maneuvering, turning a religious belief into a pathway to absolute power. Imagine, if you will, the sheer audacity of it all. You've got a vast, sprawling empire, a grumpy senate, and an army that's always looking for a good excuse to back the highest bidder. And you place a teenage priest of a foreign sun god on the throne. What could possibly go wrong? This era also saw the rise of a new kind of power broker. The imperial women, Julia Maesa, along with her sister Julia Somemias, Elagabalus's mother, formed a formidable matriarchal power base that was highly unusual in patriarchal Rome. They understood the power of propaganda and public perception, even if their chosen puppet, Elagabalus, didn't always play by their rules. They meticulously crafted his image as a divine emissary, a figure of spiritual significance, hoping this would lend legitimacy to his otherwise unconventional claim to the throne. It's a fascinating historical footnote that these women, operating within a society that largely relegated them to domestic roles, managed to wield such immense political influence. Historians still argue whether their influence was ultimately beneficial or detrimental to the stability of the Severan dynasty, but there's no denying their pivotal role in Elagabalus's ascension. So, here you are, a Roman citizen, perhaps grumbling about the latest tax increase, and suddenly you hear whispers of a new emperor, not a battle-hardened general, but a teenage priest, arriving from Syria, bringing with him a strange black stone and an even stranger devotion to a sun god you've barely heard of. It's enough to make you wonder what kind of wild, unpredictable ride you're in for. And trust me, it was going to be a bumpy one. Elagabalus' rise to power was, in many ways, a testament to the chaotic nature of Roman politics in the 3rd century AD. Imagine for a moment the aftermath of an emperor's sudden death. The air crackles with intrigue, ambition, and the clanking of legionaries' armor. When Caracalla, the reigning emperor, met his untimely end, a rather messy assassination, as was often the case in imperial Rome, the Praetorian prefect Macrinus seized the throne. Now, Macrinus was an interesting character, the first emperor who wasn't of senatorial rank, a kind of Roman rags to riches story, if you will. But his legitimacy was shaky, and the powerful women of the Severan dynasty, particularly Julia Maesa, saw their opportunity. Julia Maesa was no stranger to the levers of power. She had been a prominent figure in the court of her brother-in-law, Septimius Severus, and later, her nephew, Caracalla. She understood the importance of the army, the fickle nature of the Roman populace, and the sheer power of a good narrative. And the narrative she cooked up for her grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, our future Elagabalus, was nothing short of brilliant. She orchestrated a rumor, a whisper, that grew into a roar, that Elagabalus was, in fact, Caracalla's illegitimate son.
This was a masterstroke, as Caracalla, despite his brutalities, had been popular with the legions.
The idea that a piece of him lived on, especially in a young man connected to a powerful foreign deity, resonated with many. So in 218 AD, amidst the legions stationed near Emesa, a rebellion was fomented. Julia Maesa, with the help of her daughters and the charismatic young priest, presented Elagabalus to the troops. He was just 14 years old, yet he was dressed in the elaborate, almost theatrical robes of the high priest of Elagal, radiating an aura of divine authority. The soldiers, perhaps swayed by the rumors, perhaps by the promise of generous donatives, a very Roman incentive, declared him emperor. Imagine the scene, a sea of hardened legionaries, their shouts echoing across the Syrian landscape, proclaiming a teenage priest as their new leader. It was less a military coup and more a carefully orchestrated piece of performance art, with the fate of the Roman Empire hanging in the balance. The ensuing conflict with Macrinus was swift and decisive. Macrinus, for all his military experience, couldn't withstand the combined forces of the Severan loyalists and the fervent belief in Elagabalus' divine right. At the Battle of Antioch, Macrinus was defeated and soon after captured and executed. And just like that, our young high priest of Emesa, Varius Avitus Bassianus, was proclaimed Emperor of Rome. He adopted the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, but he was and still is widely known by the name of his god, Elagabalus. This wasn't a typical Roman succession, grounded in established traditions or senatorial approval. It was a testament to the power of a determined woman, a well-placed rumor, and a highly impressionable army. Historians still argue whether the soldiers truly believed the Caracalla parentage story or simply saw a promising opportunity for plunder and promotion. Either way, the boy emperor was on his way to Rome, and the Eternal City was about to get a taste of something truly, utterly unprecedented. With Elagabalus now proclaimed emperor, the journey from Syria to Rome must have been quite the spectacle. Imagine you're on the dusty Appian Way, perhaps leading your donkey laden with fresh produce to market, when suddenly a vast procession approaches. Not just any procession, mind you, but the newly minted emperor of Rome, a teenage priest at its head. And what's at the very center of this grand cavalcade, overshadowing even the imperial standards? A massive, black conical stone, the sacred meteorite of Elagabal, the sun god. This wasn't just a religious symbol. It was the very embodiment of his divinity, and Elagabalus was absolutely determined to place it, and its worship, at the absolute pinnacle of Roman religious life. Upon his arrival in Rome, Elagabalus immediately set about establishing the cult of Elagal as the paramount deity in the Roman pantheon. This was a radical move, practically unheard of. For centuries, Rome had absorbed and syncretized foreign gods, but they were always integrated into the existing structure, never elevated above Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the king of the gods. But Elagabalus, as the hereditary high priest, saw himself as the earthly representative of Elagal, and therefore his god must reign supreme. He ordered the construction of a magnificent new temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill, right where the Temple of Jupiter used to, sort of dominate the skyline. He even had a gigantic, gold-studded chariot built, drawn by a team of pure white horses, just to transport the sacred stone during elaborate processions. Can you picture it? The sheer theatricality of it all. A young emperor, dressed in flowing, often sheer, silk robes, more on that later, personally leading this divine parade through the streets of Rome, while the black stone glinted in the sunlight. It was a sight that must have bewildered and perhaps even unnerved many traditional Romans. He mandated that all other gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, all the old favorites, were to be subordinate to Elagabal. Their statues were brought to the Elagabalium, not as honored guests, but almost as subservient attendants to the great stone. Marriages of deities were even arranged, like the strange coupling of Elagabal with Minerva. And then later, with Urania, the Carthaginian goddess of the moon, Tanit, whose sacred image was brought from Carthage just for the occasion. It was a chaotic theological reshuffle, dictated by the whim of a teenage boy who genuinely believed he was doing the will of his divine patron. This obsessive devotion to his sun god was the cornerstone of his reign, explaining many of his subsequent actions, even the ones that might seem utterly baffling to us. Historians still argue whether his religious reforms were a genuine attempt to unify the empire under a single powerful deity, or simply the expression of a deeply ingrained cultural and personal fanaticism. Regardless, it certainly set the stage for some truly bizarre imperial behavior. And if you think a new temple and a black stone were odd, just wait until you hear about his wardrobe choices. You might actually want to make sure you're properly tucked in for this next bit. Now, if you thought Elagabalus' religious zeal was unconventional, you hadn't seen anything yet. His personal style, particularly his imperial dressing and appearance, shattered every expectation of what a Roman emperor should look like. Forget the stoic, toga-clad figures you see on busts in museums. Elagabalus was, to put it mildly, a fashionista with a penchant for the flamboyant and the utterly scandalous. You, as a humble Roman citizen, accustomed to the sight of stern men in practical tunics and dignified togas, would have been utterly agog at the emperor's public appearances. Instead of the traditional Roman purple toga, which was reserved for state occasions and symbolized gravitas, Elagabalus often favored robes of silk. And not just any silk, mind you, but brightly colored, often shimmering, and sometimes even sheer silk. Imagine the whispers, the dropped jaws, the faint sounds of senatorial fainting couches being prepared. Silk itself was a luxury, imported at immense cost from the Far East, and to wear it so openly, so wantonly, was seen as an affront to Roman austerity. But it wasn't just the material. His attire frequently incorporated gold and jewels, often sewn directly into the fabric, making him glitter like a human chandelier. He wore makeup too, which was almost unheard of for a Roman man, let alone an emperor, unless he was participating in some highly specific religious ritual or theatrical performance. We're talking kohl around the eyes, perhaps some rouge on the cheeks. He even wore wigs, often elaborately styled and dyed, a far cry from the short military-style haircuts of his predecessors. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of his appearance was his personal jewelry. He was reportedly fond of wearing women's adornments, including necklaces, bracelets, and elaborate earrings. He even applied depilatories to his body, removing all body hair, a practice considered effeminate and distinctly un-Roman for a man of his standing. It was a deliberate subversion of traditional Roman masculinity, an open defiance of centuries of cultural norms. You can almost hear the old senators sputtering into their wine cups, bemoaning the decline of Rome. Back in my day, they'd grumble. Emperors look like emperors, not like that. This wasn't just about personal taste, it was a public statement. Elagabalus was deliberately blurring the lines between male and female, Roman and foreign, sacred and profane. He was the high priest of a foreign god, and his appearance reflected that devotion, prioritizing the exotic and the divine over traditional Roman gravitas. Some historians speculate that his gender nonconformity was a genuine expression of his identity, perhaps even an early form of gender fluidity. After all, ancient sources suggest he sometimes preferred to be addressed as lady, and even sought out a sex change operation from Roman physicians, offering vast sums of money. This peculiar fringe tidbit often gets overlooked, but it paints a picture of someone truly outside the rigid boxes of their time. However, historians still argue whether these accounts are literal truths or exaggerated slanders by hostile Roman writers trying to discredit his reign. Either way, his imperial dressing and appearance were a direct challenge to the Roman psyche. And for a society that valued tradition and order above almost all else, This flamboyant disruption was a sign of the chaotic reign to come. Elagabalus didn't just dress differently. He actively worked to dismantle and reconfigure the deeply ingrained Roman traditions that had defined the Republic and Empire for centuries. Imagine being a Roman citizen, someone who grew up with certain rituals, certain expectations, certain ways of doing things, and then suddenly, a teenage emperor arrives, intent on turning everything upside down. It wasn't just a matter of changing the imperial wardrobe. It was a wholesale assault on the cultural fabric of Rome. One of his most significant, and to Romans, most horrifying, attempts to banish tradition involved the Vestal Virgins. These were among the most sacred figures in Roman society, priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta, charged with maintaining the eternal flame that symbolized the continuity and security of Rome. They took a vow of chastity, and breaking that vow was punishable by being buried alive. Their purity was paramount. So what did Elagabalus do? He married one. Not just any Vestal virgin, but Aquilia Severa, a high-ranking member of the order. This was seen as an unspeakable sacrilege, a direct affront to the gods and to the very foundations of Roman morality. He claimed it was a divine marriage, meant to unite the sacred flame of Vesta with the divine fire of Elagabal, but to the average Roman, it was simply an outrageous act of impiety. You can almost hear the gasps echoing through the forum. It was akin to someone today marrying the Pope's most sacred relic, utterly unthinkable and deeply offensive. He also targeted the Roman Senate, the venerable institution that, even if its power had waned under the emperors, still held immense symbolic authority. Elagabalus made a point of publicly humiliating senators, appointing unqualified individuals to high office purely based on their personal connections, or even more bizarrely, their physical attractiveness. He reportedly elevated actors, charioteers, and even dancers to positions of significant influence, bypassing experienced administrators and respected figures. This wasn't just inefficient. It was a deliberate slap in the face to the traditional power structures and the elite families who considered public service their birthright. You might think, oh, surely they just quietly ignored him. But no, this was a public spectacle designed to undermine their authority and place himself and his foreign god above all established Roman norms. Beyond the major institutions, he messed with smaller, everyday traditions too. The strict rules of Roman public life, the proper conduct for citizens, the long-standing customs of festivals and ceremonies, many were either ignored, mocked, or forcibly altered to suit his peculiar tastes. He was fond of staging bizarre spectacles that mixed Roman and Syrian elements, confusing and often offending the traditionalists. Historians still argue whether these actions were part of a coherent strategy to reshape Rome into a more syncretic, Eastern-influenced empire, or simply the capricious acts of a young, unhinged emperor with absolute power. What is clear, however, is that his reign was a continuous, unsettling earthquake beneath the foundations of Roman society, a relentless chipping away at everything that had defined them for centuries. And as you try to drift off to sleep, imagine the constant, low hum of anxiety that must have permeated Roman life under such a leader, where even the most basic societal structures felt unstable. The Roman Senate, often romanticized as the bastion of republican virtue, had, by Elagabalus' time, largely been stripped of its true power, yet it remained a vital symbolic body, the place where laws were ratified, where tradition was upheld, and where the legitimacy of an emperor was, at least nominally, confirmed. So, imagine the simmering tension in the Curia Julia, the Senate House, as Elagabalus. His relationship with this venerable institution was, to put it mildly, tumultuous. From the outset, Elagabalus showed a profound disrespect for the Senate and its members. He viewed them as outdated relics, resistant to his religious reforms and his general overhaul of Roman society. Instead of seeking their counsel or attempting to win their favor, he seemed to delight in humiliating them. He appointed individuals to the Senate not based on their aristocratic lineage or political experience, but on criteria that baffled and offended the established order. We're talking about men appointed to high office simply because they were good dancers, or perhaps because they had a particularly impressive physique. One peculiar tidbit that really highlights his disdain is the account of him appointing his personal barbers, charioteers, and even cooks to important administrative positions, all while publicly mocking the traditional senators. Can you imagine Senator Grumblesnort, who dedicated his entire life to public service, having to sit next to the emperor's favorite stable boy, now a newly minted consul? It's enough to make you want to quietly retire to your villa in the countryside and just grow olives. He also compelled senators to attend his religious ceremonies, where he, as the high priest of Elagabal, would perform bizarre, elaborate rituals involving dancing, self-mutilation minor, symbolic cuts, thankfully, for a sleep podcast, and animal sacrifices. These were not the dignified traditional Roman rites they were accustomed to. The senators, clad in their solemn togas, were forced to participate, or at least bear witness, to these foreign practices that they likely considered barbaric and undignified. It was a calculated move to assert the supremacy of his god and his own authority over the old Roman order, stripping the senators of their gravitas and forcing them into uncomfortable compliance. This constant humiliation and sidelining of the Senate had a ripple effect throughout Roman society. If the emperor didn't respect the traditional pillars of authority, why should anyone else? It created an atmosphere of instability and resentment, particularly among the elite. While the Senate no longer held military power, their collective disapproval could, and often did, contribute to an emperor's downfall. Historians still debate whether Elagabalus' treatment of the Senate was a deliberate, long-term strategy to centralize power entirely in the emperor's divine person, or simply the impulsive acts of a young man who despised anyone who stood in his way. Regardless, the Senate's growing animosity towards him was a crucial factor in the eventual collapse of his reign. You can almost feel the collective sigh of exasperation wafting across the centuries from those put upon Roman senators. If you thought the political and religious aspects of Elagabalus' reign were strange, wait until you hear about his banquets. Imagine being invited to a dinner party where you genuinely have no idea what edible, or indeed inedible, delights might be placed before you. His imperial feasts were legendary for their excess, their bizarre themes, and often their sheer absurdity. These weren't just meals. They were elaborate, theatrical productions designed to shock, entertain, and often to demonstrate the emperor's boundless wealth and capricious nature. One of the most famous accounts details a banquet where the dishes were made entirely of rare and precious ingredients, but served in such a way as to be utterly impractical. Think mountains of peas, but each one carefully peeled, or grains of rice, individually sorted by color. It was less about the taste and more about the incredible, painstaking effort and expense involved. One peculiar tidbit that always makes me chuckle is the story of him serving dishes made entirely of camel heels or the combs of live roosters. Just why? What culinary genius thought, you know what this banquet needs? Some rooster comb. It truly speaks to a level of excess where common sense had long since left the building. And if you think your modern-day themed party is wild, imagine a Roman banquet where the main course is flamingo brains or parrot tongues. Yes, those are actual accounts from ancient sources. You'd certainly earn some bragging rights, or perhaps just a very upset stomach. But it wasn't just the food that was peculiar. The settings and entertainment were equally extravagant. Guests might find themselves dining on couches made of solid silver, or reclining amidst a sea of fresh rose petals, so deep you could almost drown in them. There are stories of vast quantities of perfumes being poured over the guests, or exotic birds being released into the dining hall, perhaps to be caught and eaten mid-meal, or perhaps just to flutter about and annoy the senators trying to eat their camel heels. One particularly famous anecdote speaks of an instance where so many flowers were dropped from a false ceiling onto dinner guests that some were reportedly suffocated. Now, historians still argue whether this was an intentional act of malice or an unfortunate accident born of extreme extravagance. Either way, it paints a vivid, if slightly horrifying, picture of an Elagabalus dinner party. These peculiar banquets and feasts weren't just about showing off wealth. They were another form of imperial control. By forcing senators and high-ranking officials to participate in these outlandish events, Elagabalus further undermined their dignity and forced them into complicity with his bizarre reign. You couldn't exactly complain about the flamingo brains if you wanted to keep your head, could you? It was a subtle, yet effective, way of asserting his absolute dominance, turning even the simple act of dining into a demonstration of his power and his complete disregard for Roman norms. So next time you're debating whether to order takeout or cook, just be grateful you don't have to worry about a sudden downpour of rose petals or an unexpected dish of parrot tongues. Beyond the peculiar feasts, Elagabalus also orchestrated public spectacles and amusements that veered wildly from traditional Roman entertainment. If you were a Roman citizen, you were accustomed to chariot races at the Circus Maximus, gladiatorial contests in the Colosseum, and perhaps the occasional theatrical performance. These were structured, often brutal, but familiar forms of entertainment. Elagabalus, however, preferred to put on shows that were distinctly his own brand of unconventional. He had a fascination with animals, but not always in the way one might expect. There are accounts of him releasing exotic animals into the Colosseum, not for gladiatorial combat, but simply for the crowd to gawk at, or perhaps even for the animals to just wander around aimlessly. Imagine attending a lion fight and instead witnessing a peacock strutting around while the crowd wonders if they've had too much Roman wine. One peculiar tidbit claims he once harnessed 4 elephants to a chariot and drove them around his gardens, not as a display of power in a formal procession, but simply for his own amusement. You can almost hear the groundskeepers whispering, "Oh, for Jupiter's sake, not the elephants again, my prize-winning petunias." It was a display of wealth and eccentricity, devoid of the usual Roman purpose or meaning. Elagabalus also held elaborate and often scandalous theatrical performances. He himself was known to participate, taking on roles that were considered far beneath the dignity of an emperor, often dressed in revealing costumes. He'd reportedly parade through the streets dressed as a woman, or play instruments considered more suitable for prostitutes. This wasn't just a blurring of gender roles. It was a deliberate provocation of Roman sensibilities, a public embrace of the transgressive. For a society that valued gravitas seriousness and dignitas dignity in its leaders, these performances were utterly shocking. He was also fond of playing pranks, though his idea of a joke was probably not the same as yours. One famous story recounts how he once invited prominent Romans to a banquet, only for the chairs they were sitting on to suddenly collapse, leaving them sprawled on the floor amidst laughter from Elagabalus and his cronies. Another account describes him serving glass imitation jewels to guests, or even setting loose tame lions and bears during dinner parties, causing panic among the attendees for his own amusement. Historians still argue whether these acts were genuinely playful, albeit in a dark way, or if they were designed as a form of psychological torture to keep his court constantly on edge. Whatever the intent, it certainly kept everyone guessing. You could never just relax when the emperor was around, because you never knew if your next meal would be a feast or a fright. It makes you almost appreciate the predictable violence of the gladiatorial games, doesn't it? At least you knew what you were getting into there. Amidst all of Elagabalus' lavish banquets, bizarre spectacles, and shocking religious reforms, there was a particular quirk that truly stands out: his seemingly strange aversion to laughter. Now, you might think, what kind of emperor tries to ban something as fundamental as a chuckle? And that, my friend, is where our story gets particularly interesting. It wasn't a sudden, empire-wide decree that immediately outlawed all forms of mirth, like a switch being flipped across the Roman world. Instead, it seems to have manifested as a gradual, almost insidious, disapproval of overt displays of joy, particularly within his immediate imperial circle. Early signs of this peculiar aversion can be gleaned from accounts of his court behavior. While he reveled in shocking others, he reportedly found genuine, spontaneous amusement from those around him to be jarring, perhaps even disrespectful. Imagine you're at one of his aforementioned bizarre banquets, perhaps trying to suppress a giggle as a trained parrot recites Latin poetry, and you catch the emperor's eye. Instead of a smile, you're met with a chilling, unblinking stare. It's enough to make you swallow that giggle and try to look very, very serious. This wasn't just a personal preference. It began to influence the atmosphere of the court. Those who wished to gain his favor, or at least avoid his displeasure, learned to adopt a more somber demeanor. Courtiers and senators, already walking on eggshells due to his erratic behavior, now had another social minefield to navigate: the potential crime of happiness. The general understanding seemed to be that while the emperor might occasionally stage a joke like the collapsing chairs, any genuine, uncontrolled laughter from others was unwelcome. It created a strange, strained environment where merriment felt illicit. Why this aversion to laughter? Historians still argue about the exact motivation. Was it due to his intense religious devotion, believing that frivolous joy distracted from the solemn worship of Elagabal? Some scholars suggest that, as the high priest, he saw himself as a perpetually serious figure, dedicated to his god, and expected a similar gravitas from his entourage. Perhaps he viewed laughter as a sign of disrespect, a lack of reverence for his divine authority. Another peculiar tidbit is the theory that it might have been linked to a form of social anxiety, or even a peculiar psychological condition, where the sounds of unbridled joy were genuinely unsettling to him. Or perhaps, more cynically, it was another way to assert absolute control, to remind everyone that even their most basic human expressions were subject to his imperial whim. If you can control how people feel and express those feelings, you truly hold absolute power. This subtle, growing repression of mirth was a quiet precursor to more formal decrees, a chilling whisper before the storm, setting the stage for one of the most uniquely bizarre policies ever enacted by a Roman emperor. The quiet disapproval of laughter eventually escalated into something more explicit under Elagabalus, morphing into actual decrees against mirth. Imagine living in a society where the mere act of smiling too broadly, or a hearty guffaw, could be seen as an act of defiance against the emperor himself. It sounds like something out of a very peculiar dystopian novel, doesn't it? Yet, this was the reality, or at least the growing fear, for many Romans during Elagabalus' short but eventful reign. While no single, comprehensive written decree titled the Ban on Laughter Act of 220 AD has survived, historical accounts from contemporary and later Roman writers strongly suggest that Elagabalus enacted policies and fostered an atmosphere that actively discouraged and even punished expressions of joy. This wasn't necessarily about silence, but about the specific sound of unbridled human amusement. One can imagine imperial edicts being read in public squares, perhaps not directly forbidding laughter, but subtly implying severe consequences for those who indulged in unseemly levity in the emperor's presence, all within earshot of imperial servants. It's the kind of law that makes you perpetually self-conscious, isn't it? Every time you felt a chuckle bubbling up, you'd probably clamp your hand over your mouth. The enforcement of these decrees, or rather, the social pressure they created, was likely left to the emperor's increasingly powerful circle of sycophants and the ever-present imperial informants. If you wanted to curry favor, what better way than to report someone for having too good a time? You can picture the scene. A hushed conversation in the forum, a senator tells a witty anecdote, A momentary snort of laughter escapes, and then a sudden sharp glance at a passing Praetorian guard, and the immediate return to a stoic, somber expression. The air must have been thick with suppressed amusement, a kind of internal tickle that everyone was trying desperately to ignore. A peculiar tidbit illustrating the absurdity of this was Elagabalus's reported preference for court jesters and performers who were specifically not funny. He enjoyed their antics, not for genuine humor, but perhaps for the spectacle or the sheer oddity of it all. He himself might occasionally crack a joke, but it was his prerogative, not a shared experience. It was a one-way street of entertainment, controlled entirely by the emperor. This policy, whether formally written or informally enforced, served as yet another means of control. It wasn't just about controlling actions, but emotions. If an emperor could dictate when and if you were allowed to express joy, then truly, no part of your life was beyond his reach. Historians still argue whether the accounts of the laughter ban are accurate reflections of official policy or exaggerated satirical accounts by Roman writers appalled by his overall conduct. However, the consistent theme of an emperor hostile to joy suggests there was indeed a pervasive atmosphere of suppressed mirth. You wouldn't want to be caught smiling, let alone laughing, in Rome during this particular bizarre chapter of its history. So, what was life like under an emperor who, at best, tolerated, and at worst, actively disliked laughter? The social impact of Elagabalus' seemingly whimsical aversion to mirth must have been profound. Imagine a city that, for centuries, had celebrated its festivals with boisterous revelry, its triumphs with joyous shouts, and its daily life with casual banter, and the occasional outburst of humor. Now that underlying hum of human merriment was being slowly but surely stifled. You, as a Roman citizen, would probably find yourself constantly self-censoring. Did that joke really land? Is that chuckle too loud? You'd learn to develop a very subtle smile, a quiet nod of amusement, rather than an open guffaw. Social gatherings, once perhaps lively affairs, would become more subdued, more formal, as everyone kept a wary eye on their neighbors. Nobody wanted to be accused of unseemly levity, especially if a spy of the emperor was within earshot. It creates a pervasive sense of unease, a low-grade anxiety that gnaws at the edges of everyday life. Think about it. If you can't even genuinely laugh without fear of reprisal, what other fundamental freedoms are being subtly eroded? This suppression of joy wasn't just about personal expression. It filtered down into public spaces and events. While gladiatorial games continued because, let's be honest, Romans loved their gladiatorial games, the atmosphere around them might have shifted. The collective roar of the crowd, while still present for moments of high drama, might have been tempered. Its spontaneous outbursts of delight curtailed. Festivals, traditionally periods of unbridled merriment and feasting, might have taken on a more solemn, ritualistic tone, reflecting the emperor's own serious devotion to his sun god. A peculiar tidbit. Some sources suggest that even the traditional Roman practice of telling bawdy jokes and performing satirical plays at certain festivals became less common or were performed with a greater sense of caution. It's almost as if the very air of Rome was getting heavier, less effervescent. This kind of social control, exercised through subtle intimidation and fear of imperial displeasure, is incredibly effective. It doesn't require mass arrests or public executions for laughing too loudly. It simply requires everyone to believe that such consequences could happen, and that is often enough to compel conformity. Historians still argue whether the accounts of the laughter ban were entirely literal, or if they serve as a hyperbolic representation of Elagabalus' generally unpopular and unconventional reign, a way for later historians to emphasize his absurdity. But regardless of the literal truth, the narrative points to a real and perceived societal shift. The Roman Empire, under Elagabalus, became a less joyful, more watchful place. And as you drift off, perhaps consider the strange weight of a world where even a simple laugh could feel like a dangerous act of rebellion. Despite Elagabalus' peculiar decrees against mirth and the pervasive atmosphere of caution, Romans, being Romans, found subtle ways to resist and subvert the emperor's unusual policies. After all, you can't truly ban human nature, can you? It's like trying to stop the tide with a leaky bucket. While open defiance might lead to severe consequences, quiet acts of subversion are often the true test of a populace's resilience. You might imagine hushed giggles behind cupped hands in a busy marketplace, or a shared knowing glance between friends that conveys 1,000 unspoken jokes. It wasn't about outright rebellion, but about finding small pockets of normalcy in an increasingly absurd world. Perhaps a senator, after enduring a particularly tedious and laughter-free banquet, would return to his villa and indulge in a long, boisterous laugh with his trusted slaves or family members, knowing that within those private walls he was safe. It's in these small, everyday acts that the human spirit truly shines. One peculiar tidbit illustrating this quiet resistance might have been the use of satire. Roman comedy and satirical poetry had a long and robust tradition of mocking authority, even emperors. While direct, public lampooning of Elagabalus might have been too dangerous, it's plausible that plays and poems with veiled references, thinly disguised criticisms, or exaggerated portrayals of imperial absurdity continued to circulate in private circles. Imagine a playwright crafting a farce about a king who insists his subjects only weep, and the audience, with a knowing wink, understands exactly who the playwright is really talking about. It's a subtle form of resistance, a way of laughing at the absurdity without directly inviting imperial wrath. An emperor, no matter how absolute, cannot truly control the internal thoughts and feelings of his subjects. He can mandate actions, but not genuine emotions. Historians still argue about the true extent of these underground acts of defiance. Were they widespread or merely isolated incidents? Did they contribute significantly to the eventual downfall of Elagabalus? Or were they just harmless releases of tension? Regardless, the simple fact that such resistance, however small, likely occurred, underscores the innate human need for joy and expression. Even under the shadow of an emperor who disliked laughter, the Roman spirit, in its own quiet way, probably found ways to chuckle. And as you try to drift off, imagine the delightful sensation of a suppressed laugh finally being allowed to escape, a small, quiet victory in a world that tried to deny it. Elagabalus's reign wasn't just marked by his unusual religious devotion and his aversion to laughter. It was also a whirlwind of imperial marriages and scandals that further shocked Roman society. Remember, this was a society that valued tradition, stability, and legitimate succession, even if emperors often played fast and loose with those rules. But Elagabalus took fast and looses to an entirely new, almost operatic level. His first controversial marriage, as you might recall, was to the Vestal Virgin Aquilia Severa. This was already a major breach of sacred Roman law and tradition. But he wasn't content with just one scandalous marriage. He divorced her, then married Aeneia Faustina, a respected noblewoman and descendant of Marcus Aurelius, seemingly to legitimize his reign further in the eyes of the Roman aristocracy. However, this marriage too was short-lived. He divorced Aeneia Faustina as well, and then, in perhaps his most bizarre matrimonial move, remarried Aquilia Severa, claiming that a divine mandate required them to be together. It was a chaotic marital carousel, utterly bewildering to the Roman elite who valued stable family lines and proper alliances. But the scandals went deeper than just shifting wives. Elagabalus was openly and notoriously promiscuous. He reportedly had numerous male lovers, a practice that, while not entirely unheard of in Roman society, was certainly not paraded with such open disregard for imperial decorum. One peculiar tidbit that stands out is the account of him marrying a male charioteer named Hierocles, whom he reportedly elevated to a position of immense power, even calling him his husband. He was also said to have dressed as a woman and acted as a prostitute in taverns, offering himself to men. While these accounts are often exaggerated by hostile ancient sources eager to paint him in the worst possible light, they collectively depict an emperor who utterly rejected traditional Roman gender roles and sexual morality. This chaotic personal life and these scandalous marriages had significant political ramifications. They alienated the powerful Roman aristocracy, who saw their daughters and sisters treated with contempt and their traditional values openly mocked. They also created a sense of instability within the imperial succession. Who was the legitimate heir if the emperor was constantly divorcing and remarrying, and seemingly uninterested in producing a clear, traditionally recognized offspring? Historians still argue whether Elagabalus' sexual activities were a genuine expression of his identity, a deliberate provocation, or simply the unchecked desires of a young man with absolute power. Regardless of the motivation, his imperial marriages and scandals contributed significantly to the growing discontent among the Roman elite and ultimately sealed his fate. It certainly wasn't the kind of stable, dignified leadership the Romans expected from their emperor, and it paved the way for those who sought to remove him from power. Beyond his religious obsession and marital chaos, Elagabalus' reign was also characterized by truly extravagant and often ludicrous financial follies. Imagine, if you will, being the imperial treasurer under such an emperor. You'd probably spend your days with your head in your hands, wondering where the next denarius was going to vanish. The Roman Empire, for all its wealth, relied on a delicate balance of taxation, trade, and prudent spending. Elagabalus, however, seemed to view the imperial treasury as his personal piggy bank, designed solely for the most outrageous displays of luxury and caprice. His spending habits were legendary. He didn't just buy a few exotic birds. He reportedly purchased entire menageries. He didn't just enjoy a fine meal. He reportedly insisted on serving dishes made of pearls or gold dust, purely for the novelty, despite their likely unappetizing taste. Imagine trying to chew on a pearl, not exactly a culinary delight, is it? One peculiar tidbit claims he would scatter gold coins among the crowds during public spectacles, not just small change, but significant sums, causing riots as people scrambled to collect expected bounty. This wasn't generosity. It was a display of utter disregard for the value of money, a kind of opulent disdain for economic reality. He also lavished immense sums on his favorites, particularly his various male lovers and sycophants. These individuals, often of humble origins, were suddenly elevated to positions of immense wealth and influence, granted vast sums of money, properties, and precious gifts. This created widespread resentment among the traditional Roman aristocracy, who saw their inherited wealth and status diminished by the rise of these upstarts. It was a clear demonstration of Elagabalus's contempt for the established social order and his belief that his personal whims superseded any economic prudence. The impact of these financial follies was significant. While the Roman Empire was vast and resilient, continuous and unchecked imperial extravagance could, and often did, lead to financial strain. The constant flow of resources towards personal indulgence meant less money for maintaining the legions, for public works, or for addressing the empire's genuine needs. It fostered corruption, as those around the emperor sought to get their slice of the lavish pie. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's spending was solely for personal pleasure, or if there was a deeper political motive, perhaps to buy loyalty or to simply demonstrate absolute, unchallenged power through overwhelming displays of wealth. Whatever the reason, his financial extravagance alienated crucial segments of Roman society and weakened the imperial coffers. Adding another layer of instability to his already turbulent reign, you can almost hear the faint sigh of generations of frugal Roman grandmothers turning in their graves, appalled by such reckless waste. The Praetorian Guard, the elite personal bodyguard of the Roman emperors, held immense power in the 3rd century AD. Imagine them as a sort of imperial kingmaker, capable of elevating or toppling emperors with alarming regularity. Under Elagabalus, their role became even more pivotal as discontent with the emperor's rule grew. They were the muscle behind the throne, and their growing disapproval was a far more dangerous sign for Elagabalus than any amount of senatorial grumbling. Initially, the Praetorians had been instrumental in Elagabalus's ascent, swayed by Julia Maesa's propaganda and the promise of rich donatives. They had fought for him against Macrinus and ushered him into Rome. But their loyalty was conditional, based on the emperor upholding Roman values, or at least pretending to, and, crucially, maintaining their perks and pay. Elagabalus' continuous disregard for tradition, his foreign religious practices, and his bizarre personal behavior began to erode this loyalty. The Praetorians, largely drawn from Italian stock or more Romanized provinces, were generally conservative in their outlook. They might tolerate a bit of imperial eccentricity, but open sacrilege, public humiliation of Roman institutions, and the elevation of seemingly unworthy individuals to positions of power started to wear thin on their patience. Stories circulated among the guard, no doubt fueled by the disgruntled Roman elite, about Elagabalus's increasingly outrageous behavior, his public cross-dressing, his theatrical antics, and his continuous spending on personal pleasures rather than on the welfare of the legions or the stability of the empire, all contributed to a growing sense of unease. A peculiar tidbit that might have particularly irked them was Elagabalus's preference for wearing silk robes over military attire, a symbolic rejection of the very profession that upheld his power. It was like a modern general showing up to a formal review in pajamas. It just didn't sit right. The Praetorian Guard, essentially the only armed force within Rome itself, observed all this. They saw the emperor alienating the Senate, the traditional aristocracy, and even the common people with his strange cult and his unpredictable behavior. They understood that if the emperor lost the support of these key groups, his position would become untenable, and more importantly, their own position might be jeopardized. Historians still argue whether the Praetorians acted purely out of self-interest or whether they genuinely believed they were restoring Roman order and dignity. What is clear is that their rising discontent transformed them from the emperor's bodyguards into his potential executioners. The whispers of disloyalty began to grow louder within their barracks, and for an emperor who already had so many enemies, the alienation of his personal guard was the most dangerous development of all. You can almost feel the tension building, can't you? That low, rumbling threat from the very people sworn to protect him. With the Praetorian Guard's loyalty wavering, the whispers of treachery against Elagabalus began to coalesce into concrete plots and conspiracies. Imagine the dark, hushed meetings in smoke-filled Roman taverns or clandestine gatherings in the villas of disgruntled senators, all plotting the downfall of an emperor who had alienated almost everyone. The air in Rome must have been thick with intrigue, a silent, deadly game of chess playing out beneath the veneer of imperial spectacle. At the heart of many of these conspiracies was Elagabalus's own grandmother, Julia Maesa. Remember her? The shrewd political mastermind who had engineered his rise to power. Well, she had grown increasingly alarmed by his behavior. Elagabalus's excesses weren't just embarrassing. They were destabilizing the empire and, more importantly, jeopardizing the Severan dynasty itself. She had painstakingly built this family's claim to power, and her grandson was actively tearing it down with his bizarre religious cult, his outrageous parties, and his continuous public scandals. He was becoming a liability, and Julia Maesa was not one to let sentimentality get in the way of dynastic survival. Julia Maesa, ever the pragmatist, understood that a change was necessary. Her solution was a classic Roman move: groom a replacement. She turned her attention to her other grandson, Alexianus, the son of her other daughter, Julia Mamaea. Alexianus was a quiet, studious, and, crucially, normal Roman boy. He was being tutored in traditional Roman virtues, receiving a proper education, and presented as a stark contrast to the flamboyant Elagabalus. A peculiar tidbit: Julia Maesa even convinced Elagabalus to adopt Alexianus as his heir and grant him the title of Caesar, claiming that he needed a partner in his imperial duties. Elagabalus, perhaps momentarily blinded by his own self-importance, or simply too distracted by his latest outlandish project, fell for it. He even renamed Alexianus as Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, clearly trying to link him to the revered good emperors. This adoption was a fatal miscalculation for Elagabalus, as it provided his enemies with a legitimate alternative, a ready-made successor. The Praetorian Guard, seeing Alexianus as a more suitable and stable emperor, began to shift their allegiance more openly. The contrast between the two cousins was stark. One, a wild, effeminate priest of a foreign god; the other, a young, promising Roman prince. Historians still argue about the exact timing and nature of Julia Maesa's direct involvement in the final plot. Did she actively orchestrate the assassination, or simply ensure that the conditions were ripe for the Praetorians to act? Regardless, the stage was set. The whispers turned into murmurs, the murmurs into outright discontent, and soon the Praetorian Guard would make their decisive move, ending a reign that had pushed the boundaries of Roman eccentricity to their absolute breaking point. The end for Elagabalus was as chaotic and dramatic as his reign itself. By March of 222 AD, the patience of the Praetorian Guard had worn dangerously thin. Their loyalty had fully shifted to the young and promising Severus Alexander, egged on by his clever and determined grandmother, Julia Maesa. The final act of this strange imperial drama unfolded not on a grand battlefield, but within the confines of the Praetorian camp in Rome. On March 13, 222 AD, Elagabalus, perhaps sensing the shift in allegiance, but too arrogant or oblivious to truly grasp the danger, attempted to punish some of the Praetorian guards who had shown favor to Alexander. This was his fatal mistake. The guard, already at their breaking point, revolted. Imagine the sudden chaos, the clanging of armor, the shouts of angry soldiers, the rapid unraveling of imperial authority. Elagabalus, along with his mother, Julia Samias, desperately sought refuge in the Praetorian barracks, believing that the very men who had sworn to protect him would shield him from their own rage. A peculiar tidbit from ancient accounts suggests that Elagabalus tried to hide in a chest, or even in a latrine. Such was his desperation. This attempt to evade capture was futile. The Praetorians, now fully committed to Alexianus, burst into the barracks. They dragged Elagabalus and his mother from their hiding places. It was a swift, brutal, and utterly undignified end for an emperor who had so often flouted dignity. Both Elagabalus and Julia Somias were summarily executed. Their bodies, in a final act of utter contempt, were subjected to further humiliation. Elagabalus' body was reportedly dragged through the streets of Rome, paraded as a warning and a spectacle, before being thrown into the Tiber River. This was a particularly gruesome and symbolic act, as it denied him the traditional Roman burial rites and ensured that his memory would be literally erased from the land. Julia Soemias's body suffered a similar fate. The immediate aftermath was one of swift purification and restoration. The cult of Elagabal was immediately dismantled. The sacred black stone, once the centerpiece of imperial worship, was either returned to Amisa or quietly hidden away, its power utterly negated. All the symbols and practices associated with Elagabalus' reign were systematically erased from public view. Alexianus, now known simply as Severus Alexander, was proclaimed emperor, ushering in a period that was, at least initially, marked by a return to more traditional Roman values and a concerted effort to undo the damage of his predecessor. Historians still argue about the precise details of the murder itself and the extent of Julia Maesa's direct involvement, but the outcome was clear. The young priest-emperor, who had tried to ban laughter and reshape Rome in his own image, met a violent end. A stark reminder of the volatile nature of imperial power. And as you drift off, consider the abrupt silence that must have fallen over Rome once the chaos subsided. A silence that perhaps for the first time in years was not tinged with fear of laughter, but with the quiet relief of an empire attempting to regain its composure. The legacy of Elagabalus, the Roman emperor who tried to ban laughter and usher in a new era of sun worship, is a peculiar one. He remains one of the most controversial and often sensationalized figures in Roman history, largely due to the accounts of ancient writers who delighted in cataloguing his excesses. But how do we truly remember the laugh banisher? For centuries, his name has been synonymous with imperial decadence, religious fanaticism, and sexual deviancy. Ancient historians, particularly those writing after his death, painted a picture of an emperor utterly consumed by his own bizarre desires, a ruler who neglected the empire for personal gratification. They emphasized his foreign origins, his effeminate appearance, and his perceived madness, all in an effort to present him as an aberration, a stark warning of what could happen when Roman traditions were abandoned. This narrative, while vivid and entertaining, should always be viewed through a critical lens. These writers often had their own agendas, seeking to legitimize the new regime of Severus Alexander or to reinforce traditional Roman morality. So, while we have many colorful anecdotes, disentangling fact from deliberate slander can be tricky. Yet, despite the likely exaggerations, the core of his legacy persists. He was an emperor who deliberately challenged the very foundations of Roman identity. His attempt to elevate the cult of Elagabal above all other Roman deities was not just a religious reform, it was a cultural revolution. His disregard for the Senate, his peculiar punishments like perhaps a scowl for a smile, and his chaotic personal life all contributed to an image of a ruler deeply out of step with his times. A peculiar tidbit, even in later Roman sources, Elagabalus often served as a shorthand for everything wrong with excessive imperial power. A cautionary tale whispered in the halls of subsequent emperors. Historians still argue about the true nature of his motivation. Was he a genuinely devout mystic who believed he was fulfilling a divine prophecy? Was he a shrewd political operator trying to centralize power through religious reform? Or was he simply a spoiled, misguided teenager thrust into absolute power with no proper guidance, acting on impulsive whims? There's no simple answer, and perhaps it was a chaotic mix of all these things. His reign, though brief, left an indelible mark, not for its military victories or administrative achievements, but for its sheer, undeniable weirdness. It serves as a fascinating case study of how deeply ingrained cultural norms can be disrupted, and how even the most absolute power can be brought down by a combination of alienation, tradition, and a very annoyed military. And as you ease into the quiet, remember that even in the long, serious annals of history, there's always room for a truly bizarre chapter. After the dramatic and violent end of Elagabalus' reign, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. The restoration of order was immediate, and, for many, deeply welcome. With Severus Alexander now on the throne, guided by his capable mother, Julia Mamaea, and the ever-present influence of Julia Maesa, the empire began to pull itself back from the brink of chaos. Severus Alexander, a young man of just 14 at the time of his ascension, was presented as the antithesis of Elagabalus. He was depicted as virtuous, pious, and respectful of traditional Roman customs, gone with the lavish, scandalous banquets, replaced by more restrained and dignified imperial gatherings. The wild, flamboyant fashion of Elagabalus gave way to more traditional Roman attire. The foreign sun god, Elagabal, was relegated to the sidelines, and the traditional Roman pantheon, with Jupiter firmly at its head, was restored to its rightful place. Imagine the relief among the old Roman families who had watched in horror as their sacred traditions were trampled. Suddenly, they could breathe again, knowing that the empire was, at least outwardly, returning to the familiar rhythms of Roman life. Severus Alexander made a concerted effort to mend fences with the Senate, treating its members with respect and listening to their counsel. He surrounded himself with experienced administrators and legal scholars, moving away from Elagabalus' practice of appointing unqualified favorites. He also focused on practical matters of governance, such as public works, legal reforms, and maintaining the loyalty of the legions through regular pay and traditional military discipline, rather than through theatrical displays. This was a return to a more conventional style of imperial rule, one that prioritized stability and competence over divine eccentricity. However, despite this concerted effort to restore order, the brief but impactful reign of Elagabalus left a subtle lingering mark. It highlighted the fragility of imperial power and how quickly a ruler could alienate almost every segment of society. It also underscored the growing influence of the imperial women, particularly Julia Maesa and Julia Mamaea, who continued to wield significant power behind the scenes during Alexander's minority. A peculiar tidbit: while Alexander's reign brought a period of relative calm, it also subtly revealed the deep factionalism within the Severan dynasty itself, showcasing the power struggles that simmered beneath the surface of apparent unity. Historians still argue about the true extent of Alexander's own agency in his early reign, and whether he was truly the virtuous emperor he was portrayed to be, or simply a more palatable puppet for his powerful female relatives. Regardless, the Roman Empire, having survived an emperor who tried to ban laughter and turn its traditions on their head, moved forward, ever resilient, ever adapting, but perhaps a little more wary of the eccentricities that absolute power could unleash. And now, as the last echoes of ancient Rome's most peculiar emperor fade into the vast expanse of history, feel the gentle quiet settle around you. The stories of peculiar punishments and strange deities, of emperors who preferred silk to steel, are now safely tucked away in the archives of your mind. Let the lingering images drift softly, like dust motes in a sunbeam, settling into a comfortable stillness. The grandeur of Rome, its quirks and its solemnities, can now recede, becoming a soft, distant hum. There's no need to wonder about the solemn faces of senators or the suppressed giggles of citizens. Those anxieties belong to a bygone era. Your own space is now calm and peaceful, a haven where only the most soothing thoughts are permitted to linger. The journey through history is complete for tonight, and all that remains is the quiet descent into a restful, dream-filled sleep.